morning, everyone. Thank you. We're gonna cover a topic now that, in my judgment, never gets enough attention in the Iran policy discussion. Since 1979, Iran has exploited the tool of terrorism abroad as a means of their own statecraft. Assassinations, bombings, and regular attacks are features of the Islamic Republic's modus operandi. It began soon after the birth of the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution in 1980, when an American gunman who was hired by the new Islamic regime killed a former Iranian diplomat in Bethesda, Maryland. There have been similar assassinations in Europe, including the late Iranian Prime Minister, Shapur Bakhtiar, who was killed by agents of the Islamic Republic in France in 1991. And of course, we all know the story. In 2011, US authorities, including disrupted an attempt by the IRGC to bomb a Georgetown restaurant in an attempt to murder Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States. And of course, if that bombing had been successful, it would have killed dozens, if not hundreds, of Americans. In just the last few years alone, the US Department of Justice has indicted an Iranian intelligence network for attempted kidnapping of an Iranian-American journalist and human rights activist, Masih al-Najad, from her home in Brooklyn, New York. Masih will be with us later today. It has also indicted IRGC agents for murder-for-hire scheme, which targeted former US National Security Advisor John Bolton, who was a UANI advisory board member, and multiple cabinet secretaries are reportedly under threat as well as UANI leadership and other think tanks. The US intelligence community has consistently warned in regular worldwide threat assessments that Iran has been trying to develop networks inside the United States for terror operations. This threat is terribly real. Here with us today, we have the honor of hosting my friend, Lisa Monaco, the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. Lisa is on the front lines of the US government's response to these threats. She is a former federal prosecutor, served as the Chief of Staff to the FBI Director, and was Assistant Attorney General of the National Security Division when Washington thwarted the 2011 plot to kill the Saudi ambassador. She later served as the Homeland Security Advisor to President Barack Obama, a position I held under President George W. Bush. Lisa, we're honored to have you join us today, as it is rare for someone in your position to speak publicly on this topic. And I think the more we speak about it, the more helpful it is. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Fran. It is great to see you. I wish I were sitting there with you, but thank you so much for having me. I also want to thank my friend, Senator Joe Lieberman, for the invite. He obviously, and for his incredible life of service. I was privileged to work with him on the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense when I was out of government. So for many, many reasons, I'm pleased to be with you. And I couldn't agree with your lead-in, Fran, more. It's incredibly important to talk about the challenges we face and the threat we face. So I'm really pleased to be with you.
Thanks, Lisa. Let's get right into it. You know, you've been looking at this threat throughout your entire career in federal government. Talk to us about how you see the current threat. It feels like, to those of us on the outside, that it's increasing, but tell us what you see.
So I think you hit the nail on the head in kind of your tee-up, Fran. I would say a few things. One, just kind of stepping back from an overall perspective. I think I would term it as increasingly sophisticated and multi-dimensional. I think we'll get into the cyber piece of this. It's not something you hit on in the lead-up to, but I think that's yet another example of the increasing and multi-dimensional threat. I also think it's increasingly brazen. You mentioned the 2011 plot when I was the Assistant Attorney General for National Security that we disrupted. I think you can draw a line from there to where we are today, and we'll talk about that. And the most concerning, from my perspective, from both my present seat and our former seat, as you alluded to, as Homeland Security Advisor, is the threat posed to the homeland and this seeking to develop and use networks and proxies. Obviously, we know Iran has done that for many, many years abroad, but seeing that develop and manifest here, as we have in a number of cases that we've brought this year, is most concerning. As you kind of alluded to, the intelligence community, the DNI, has been very, very explicit that Iran will continue to threaten U.S. interests, their overall goal being, of course, to erode U.S. influence and for the government of Iran and its proxies to project power in the region. But we know, and we have seen, that Iran will seek to continue to seek to threaten U.S. persons and interests directly and via their proxies. From an evolutionary perspective, I definitely think this is a threat that has evolved and has increased. Let's take the 2011 Arbab-CR case as kind of somewhat of a starting point, although, of course, as you noted in your opening, it predates that. But I saw that this was a case where we charged and disrupted a plot, including by Mansour Arbab-CR and Golem Shukuri, to assassinate the Saudi ambassador, Adel al-Jubeir. It was directed by the government of Iran and elements of the IRGC. And I think it represented a crossing of a line of sorts, a willingness to deploy assets here, to act against our partner, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, to act on U.S. soil, and to do so without any regard to a potential mass casualty event, as you noted, this bombing, the plan to bomb a restaurant in Georgetown. So it was incredibly brazen. And I think our disruption of that plot was also an example of the FBI, the Department of Justice, working with our intelligence and law enforcement partners here and abroad to say, yes, we are going to disrupt, but we also are going to call this out. And I sat in meetings, both here in the department and in the Situation Room, to say, we are going to explicitly call this crossing of a line out. We are going to be very clear about it, and we are going to detail it. And the other thing is, Fran, we didn't treat this as a solely law enforcement issue. Arbab-CR was captured here. He was detained and interrogated for multiple days from an intelligence perspective, even before he entered a courtroom, precisely because we saw it as an ongoing active threat. And we sought first and foremost to disrupt that threat and to gain as much intelligence as possible. And it was quite fruitful. Ultimately, of course, he pled guilty and serving a 25-year sentence. That line, then draw that forward, and we can talk about the cyber elements of the threat Iran poses, including by its proxies. But then, of course, this year alone, the disruption of 2 plots against Americans on U.S. soil, again, seeking to deploy assets here. One, a horrible plot to first lure and then to kidnap Ms. Ahmadinejad, as you noted, solely because she is a outspoken activist and author and journalist and human rights proponent who should, of course, have the right, as we all should, to speak freely and speak our minds. And she challenges the regime and now has faced myriad threats because of it. And then, of course, the really brazen plot against Ambassador Bolton, a murder for hire scheme that, if it weren't so appalling, you would think it was ripped from the headlines of some made-for-TV movie. There's a murder for hire plot where, again, elements of Iran trying to pay proxies to go after, and in the words of the defendant, eliminate the target.
Lisa, not to undermine the importance of the other cases, but I think it really crosses a whole new line when a foreign actor is going to deploy assets in the U.S. to target and kill any American, much less a former senior official. And as we know, John Bolton is not the only person, Ambassador Bolton wasn't the only person that was subject to this threat. Ambassador Brian Hook, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It's really outrageous. I can't think of another state that we've seen have such a broad-based program of targeting Americans inside the United States. Has the administration considered indicting the Supreme Leader and other members of the IRGC? I mean, I know you've moved forward in the case against Ambassador Bolton.
Sure. Well, look, you're quite right. We've moved forward on the case against Ambassador Bolton, and there, of course, indicted an individual named Persafi, clearly a operative of the government of Iran. And look, I think you're quite right that it represents a sea change, right? Brazenly going after externally directed plot against a former national security advisor. I think what I would say is we have been exceptionally clear from the administration's perspective that a plot against or a threat to Americans, full stop, is unacceptable. Certainly with respect to the plot against Ambassador Bolton, brought swift action and swift rebuke, and won't be tolerated in any effort to go after Americans, let alone, as you said, current or former officials. The Iranians will face very stiff consequences.
So you mentioned the cyber attacks. Last week, you all indicted 3 Iranian nationals for cyber attacks against U.S. entities and individuals, including a domestic violence shelter in Pennsylvania. UANI itself has been the target of Iranian hackers. With the news that Albania severed relations with Iran over a cyber attack on its own critical infrastructure, can you describe how the U.S. is working to deter Iranian threat actors from targeting critical infrastructure?
Sure. Look, I think here again, this is an evolution and an increasingly concerning threat from Iran on the cyber front. I'd say a few things on this. One, we always have talked about Iran as one of the kind of big 4 when it comes to the cyber threat: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Anybody you talk to in this space will rattle off those 4 as being the most concerning. But they also will be equally honest with you that Iran has never been the most capable player in that constellation. However, one of the things I think that is particularly concerning about their work in activity in the cyber realm has been their increasing willingness to, frankly, seek to punch above their weight. And that's a real problem, right? Going after critical infrastructure here in Israel, as we've seen in the attacks on the water sector, going after critical infrastructure housed by states that are more capable cyber actors than them, I think is a willingness to take a level of risk that we all should be concerned about. From a cyber perspective also, we have seen the evolution, I think, is quite interesting. Many, I know, Fran, will remember, and many in your audience will remember, the days of 2012 and 2013, the DDoS attacks on our financial sector. I think realistically, we could characterize those as ultimately a nuisance level of attack, although at the time, I know the financial services executives that I spoke to didn't quite feel that way, but realistically, it was really a nuisance level attack. Track that forward, 2013, the attack against the Bowman Dam, critical infrastructure here. 2014, and I think this gets lost, Frank, a lot of people think about the first destructive cyber attack that was in their consciousness as being the attack on Sony Pictures in 2014, in the sense of a cyber attack there from North Korea having destructive effect on a U.S. entity in the form of literally turning the business computers into bricks, right, being completely useless. The reality of this is, though, the first such destructive cyber attack on U.S. soil, as you know, was done against the Sands Casino in Las Vegas, and it was done by Iran in response to comments made by the head of the Sands Casino. So, that destructive cyber attack now carry it forward to these critical infrastructure attacks that we've seen is, I think, again, an evolution of Iran's willingness to use cyber as a means of what I call geopolitical one-upsmanship and trying to be in the game along with these other significant powers.
Let me ask you, one of our concerns has always been Iran's acting through their proxies, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah. The Justice Department has prosecuted Hezbollah cases here in the United States. Can you talk to us about the threat of Iran's Hezbollah proxies here in the U.S.?
So look, I think we have to be quite clear-eyed about Iran's use of proxies to include Hezbollah. As you noted, the use of proxies, most concerningly thus far, we have seen by Iran against U.S. interests abroad. Of here, of course, we all have very front of mind attacks on U.S. service members and our partners and allies overseas in Iraq through the use of Shia militias and the like. But I do think we've got to be quite clear-eyed that Hezbollah, as being one of the main proxies for the government of Iran, is something. It is a tool in their arsenal that we have to be very clear-eyed about.
But is the threat from Hezbollah here in the United States, do you view that as something that's increasing or more sophisticated? Is it a steady state? How would you describe it?
You know, this is something where I think, and obviously I'm going to rely on the intel community assessment here at this stage, and I've not seen them separate that out at this stage.
So I can't think of other examples, frankly, but perhaps you can, of a foreign power acting here inside the United States to target U.S. citizens. Have there been other instances of countries other than Iran doing this? So
not at the level of the brazenness of the Ahmadinejad, the Ababsiyar plot against Adel al-Jubeir, and of course the Bolton plot. I would call out here, though, Fran, we have seen the PRC engage in a steady level, and we have indicted a number of cases and disrupted a number of these plots of efforts to intimidate, harass dissidents here in the United States. I worry about how some of those actors could escalate their efforts, because we have seen them be quite aggressive. And literally, I can think of literally half a dozen cases just in this year alone that we have disrupted and charged of PRC elements here in the United States seeking to intimidate, harass dissidents here.
And before I let you go, let me ask you one question. The United States has put in a very aggressive sanctions regime against Iran, but of course, it's like you build a wall and they build a higher fence, right? And so there's always sanctions evasion. How can the United States more effectively go after the sanctions evasion, particularly ship-to-ship transfers, spoofing, and other tactics that they're using to get around them?
So I think three things we can be doing, Fran. One, we have, I'm proud to say, the division I used to have the privilege of leading, the National Security Division, has now adopted a voluntary self-disclosure program, kind of taking a page from our colleagues in the criminal division and the fraud section there, you know, asking companies to come forward where they see this and self-disclose. So that is one avenue where we're really trying to highlight our concern and interest in disclosing and exposing this activity. The other is working with our partners across the spectrum. And here, very pointedly, I include non-governmental agencies and organizations like UANI, like others in this space, who can help share information that we can then include and pair up with information that only the government and our partners and allies would have access to, and create the picture that allows us to go after this illicit behavior. And then the third thing I would say, Fran, is we are, and you're seeing us do this in the space that we are very aggressively occupying in going after Russian sanctions evasion in response to the unprovoked and unjust aggression by Russia in Ukraine. We have set up something we call Task Force Klepto Capture. And if folks want to help come up with different and better names for these task forces, I'm all ears. But that is most decidedly a cross-government effort where we are really increasing the intel sharing with that task force to go and identify the shell companies, expose the money laundering that fuels this type of sanctions evasion, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran.
Lisa, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for your ongoing service and being such a good partner with UANI. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.